Today's lecture focuses on changing market equilibria in the supply and demand model, where all consumers and producers are price takers. So we're going to start with the example of the market for quinoa, a traditional South American grain, which has become recently popular in the US and Europe. You can eat it like oatmeal. We want to think about how this new interest in quinoa has impacted its equilibrium price and quantity in the supply and demand model that we introduced on Monday. So one piece of data that we need to be able to explain is the increase in the quantity of quinoa produced in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. So between 2001 and 2011, we see the quantity produced is almost doubled. We can also see that the imports, measured here in millions of dollars, have increased substantially over this period, to especially the European Union, but also Canada and the United States. Right? And finally, we've got some data on the price of quinoa. We see in 2001, it was selling for about $400 a ton on average across both Bolivia and Peru, and that increased substantially by 2010. Right? What does this mean for the supply and demand model? Well, if we put thousands of tons of quinoa, the quantity of quinoa on the horizontal axis, and the price per ton on the vertical axis, we can use this data we see here, right, to figure out what the model would have to, how the curves would have to be lined up to fit the data that we have. So this is one piece of data that we actually know, that back in 2001, right, there was about 46,000 tons of quinoa produced, and it was selling for $400 per ton. Right? That data point is in fact something that we observe in the real world. We also observed in the real world that in 2011, there was almost twice as much quinoa produced, 80,000 tons, and it was selling for about $1,300 per ton. Right? So that's all we observe in the world. But we can make the assumption that if all that changed was an increase in demand, then both these points would have been on a single supply curve. And here I drew this supply curve as a curve, actually, to make sure that I never had a point. Right? If it had been a straight line, we would have had a negative marginal cost for very low amounts of quinoa, which doesn't make any sense. Presumably, every ton of quinoa you produce costs something to produce. Maybe the first ton costs as little as $200 to produce, perhaps because some land is particularly well suited for quinoa production, or some farmers are particularly good at farming quinoa. Right? But the idea is if all that change was demand, then both these points would have had to been on a single supply curve, where this is the cheapest quinoa to produce, and it gets more and more expensive to produce each ton as you produce more and more tons, perhaps because you're moving to less and less good land for growing quinoa. And then the demand curves, right, would have to be something like originally this demand curve 1. Right? In 2001, demand might have been something like this. In 2011, when demand increased, we just moved along that supply curve. So we had both a higher level of production, a higher quantity of production, and a higher price of production. Right? So this change in price and quantity, is the change efficient? Well, it arguably is. Right? People found out that they liked quinoa. They started buying a lot more of it. And the market's response was to produce this quinoa, right, on this section of the supply curve, to start producing the other most cheapest quinoa. We're still not producing, or in 2011, they still weren't producing this quinoa up here. They had even higher marginal cost, but they were producing all of this quinoa here. It was an efficient response. Whether or not it's fair is much more difficult to say. Right? For all the new consumers in the EU and the United States and so on buying quinoa, it's presumably fair enough. Right? What might strike some people as unfair is there were some people buying quinoa back in 2011 who were maybe willing to pay not all that much money, perhaps because they didn't have a lot of money, including consumers in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, right? When the price more than tripled for the crop that they were used to consuming, right? Some consumers in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia were no longer able or willing to pay that price for quinoa, and so they are crowded out in the market. So it's not necessarily fair, but it is an efficient response. Let's return to the example from Monday and think about what happens when you have an increase in demand for textbooks. So the original competitive equilibrium we had was that there are going to be 24 textbooks exchanged for $8 each. Right? They're going to be at point A. Now imagine that we have a new increased demand for textbooks. Right? When the course becomes more popular, for example, that could increase demand for textbooks, then there would be excess demand at a price of $8. Right? The number of people wanting to buy a textbook would be greater than the number of people wanting to sell a textbook. And that competition among buyers is going to push the price up. Right? Some of the people are going to see, hey, there are way more people wanting to buy a textbook and sell them. Maybe every time one gets posted on Amazon, it gets snatched up right away. Right? I'll offer someone selling a textbook a little bit extra money to try to make sure I get one. And as buyers compete with one another, they can compete the price up until you get to a new equilibrium here of 32 books being sold for $10 each. Here, all the original sellers are going to continue to sell books. Right? So all these people here would still sell a book when the price goes from $8 to $10. They'd be happy to see the price went up. Right? But there are also going to be some new sellers, right? So these are sellers who didn't sell before, but now they do sell. And similarly, right, some of the original buyers are no longer going to purchase at the higher price. So these folks here along the original demand curve were willing to pay more than $8 for a book, but no more than $10 per book. When the course becomes more popular and demand shifts out, these people, right, are no longer going to purchase a book. The people who are purchasing the book are now the people who are interested in taking the course, right? The people who are now attracted to the course. So an increase in demand clearly benefits the sellers of books in this case, right? A rise in the price increases the producer surplus. And we can see that simply, right? That the original producer surplus was this area here, right? It was the difference between the price, the original price of $8, and what sellers were willing to accept for the book, right? Or it was $72 of consumer surplus if we measure out the area of this triangle. The new producer surplus is going to be larger, right? It's this whole blue triangle. And if you calculate it out, you see the producer surplus has gone from $72 to $128, right? If you're someone selling something that the price goes up for, your surplus is going to go up in a competitive market. When the course becomes more popular, we say there's an increase in demand, right? We can also say that the quantity demanded increases for any given price. So at a price of $10, for example, at the old demand curve, there would have been about 20 books demanded, but in the new demand curve, there are 32 books demanded. We can also say that the equilibrium quantity supplied increases, right? Because at point B, the equilibrium quantity supplied has gone from 24, where it was at A, to 32, where it is at B. But this is a change. This changes a movement along that same supply curve, right? We didn't actually shift the supply curve. We just moved along the supply curve. So the supply curve doesn't shift, and we don't say there was an increase in supply. We say there was an increase in the quantity supplied. So this is sort of subtle, but in this example, right, we had an increase in demand, and that led to an increase in both the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. But you only have an increase in demand in this example, right? Sometimes we'll have an increase in demand, sometimes we'll have an increase in supply, or a reduction in supply, or a reduction in demand. But it's important to recognize that if you're moving along a curve, right, rather than shifting the curve, then you're not actually changing the demand or supply, whatever that curve is. So you'll be working through this sort of example, right, in homework 3.1, right? The final part of it, part H, right? You work through a new shift in demand as the textbook becomes more popular, and you calculate out the new price, quantity, consumer surplus, and producer surplus, just like we did in the previous slide. I want to return to the example of the bread market that we used on Monday, right? So recall, in the bread market, there's a marginal cost curve, right, which shows the marginal cost of producing loaves at a bunch of different bakeries, right? Remember here, the idea was we have 5,000 loaves produced in equilibrium, sold for €2 each, right? We had 50 bakeries, so each bakery was producing 100 loaves, right? And if demand had been, if there was an increase in demand for bread, right, we'd shift out the demand curve slightly, right, and we would increase the price slightly, but it wouldn't increase it a huge amount because every bakery would just be producing a few more loaves, right, which would cost them a little extra, but not a lot extra per loaf. So the market supply curve, remember, is the marginal cost of bread. Here again, the first loaf for every bakery costs them just €1. And as they produce more and more bread, there's too many cooks in the kitchen, or for some reason, the cost of producing bread increases the more loaves they produce, presumably because they're running into the capacity of what their bakery can do given its size. The original equilibrium is 5,000 loaves sold for €2 each. Suppose the bakeries discover a technique that reduces the cost of baking bread. What's that going to do? Well, that would shift down the marginal cost of producing bread. Now, instead of costing €1 to produce the first loaf, it might cost just 70 euro cents to produce the first loaf, and so on, right? So you can see the marginal cost is now lower for every given number of loaves. So this lowers the marginal cost curve. Or you could think of it as shifting out the supply curve, right? Remember, the marginal cost curve is the supply curve, right? And as we shift down the marginal cost, you could also think of it as shifting the supply curve to the right, right? Now, at the equilibrium price, there would actually be excess supply. At a price of €2, there would be more bread produced, right, supplied, than would be demanded by people. And that's going to push the price down, right, as those bakeries realize there aren't enough consumers wanting to buy bread at €2, they would compete, lower the price, and make sure they sell the loaves they produce until they reach the new equilibrium, right? Bread selling for about 160, right? Oh, sorry, 170, right? And at a price of €1.70, there are 6,000 loaves sold, right? So here, a reduction in the cost of baking bread, right, is going to lead to a higher quantity of bread sold and a lower price that it would sell. As we say, it shifts out the supply curve, right? But it increases the quantity demanded. It doesn't increase demand because the demand curve is not shifted. But at the lower price, more people will buy bread, presumably because they're gonna, reallocate some of their eating from, say, pasta to bread. An increase in the number of bakeries also increases the supply of bread. So remember, at the original equilibrium, the price was €2, right? And the quantity sold was 5,000, and there are 50 bakeries producing 100 loaves each. All firms here were earning a profit, and the reason for that was the price of €2 was greater than their average cost, which you can't see in this figure, but they were producing a positive profit. If profits are positive, though, and the costs of entry are small, then more firms are going to enter this market. When firms enter the market, that's going to shift out the supply curve, right, in this sort of way. Remember that the market supply is simply the horizontal summation of every firm's supply for any given price. Right? The way we found out that this is the market supply curve is we said, well, if the price were $2, right, one firm would produce 100 loaves, but 50 firms would then produce 5,000 loaves. And as we enter more and more firms, then at a price of $2, right, we're going to have more and more loaves produced because there are more and more firms producing 50 loaves each. So as firms enter, it also shifts out the supply curve, but it does it in a way that doesn't change the fact that the first loaf still costs every bakery exactly $1 or €1 to produce. So an increase in the number of bakeries is also going to reduce the equilibrium price and increase the equilibrium quantity, right? The question is, how long are firms going to enter this market? As firms enter the market, that's going to reduce the price and increase the quantity. But how long will they do that? Firms are going to enter the market as long as they can earn a positive profit, right? So at point A, right, our initial equilibrium, we have 100 loaves, right? For each firm produces 100 loaves that sells for €2 each. And since there are 50 firms, that means there are 5,000 loaves produced for €2 each. Every firm is also earning a profit, and that's going to lead more firms to want to enter the market. As more firms enter the market, that's going to shift the market supply curve, right? Like this, reduce the equilibrium price. That means actually every given firm, right? There are now more firms, but every given firm is actually going to reduce slightly the amount of loaves it produces, because as the price falls in the market, then they're going to shift down their marginal cost curve. They're no longer going to produce the loaves that cost more for them to produce than they get at price B. At B, firms are still earning a profit because they're selling at a price that's still greater than their average cost. And because of that, more firms are going to continue to enter the industry, right? That's going to continue to shift out the market supply curve until we get to something like point C, right? At point C, we're finally at the point where no firms are going to want to enter the industry anymore. The reason for that is you can see at a price of €1.50 down here, we see that this is actually on the firm's zero economic profit curve, or on their average cost curve, which means now these firms are selling bread even less than 80 loaves. Now they're selling 70 loaves or so. They're selling these loaves at €1.50, which is actually exactly their average cost, which means they're just exactly covering the cost of producing bread. You might wonder, why would any firm be interested in producing something where they sell at exactly their average cost? Remember that when we think about the cost for these firms, we're including the cost of managing the firm, the cost of paying rent to the owner of the place where you have your bakery, or if you own that place yourself, paying yourself the same rate of return you would get from, say, having to rent it out to somebody else, and so on. So you're covering all that. So these firms are making what you economists call a normal profit, but they're not making any super profits. At point C, then all firms are going to earn zero economic profit, because the idea is firms will continue to enter this industry, baking, until profits are brought down to zero. Economic profits are brought down to zero. So in the long run, the competitive equilibrium is a price of €1.50, and the quantity supplied is going to be 6,400 loaves at a price of €1.50. That's how many loaves are going to be demanded, right? The profit for each firm is going to be zero, and each firm is going to produce, sorry, not 70, exactly 64 loaves, right? They're actually going to be 100 firms in the end instead of just 50, right? And the way we see that is at point C, right? There's 6,400 loaves total, and we see each firm here is producing exactly 64 loaves, so there must have been 100 firms. So changes in consumers' willingness to pay is going to shift the demand curve, and changes in firms' costs will shift the supply curve, right? So I want you to sit down with a piece of paper and think about what would happen to the short-run equilibrium price and quantity with various changes, and each one of these changes should probably only affect one of the curves, supply or demand curve. So one thing is going to hold constant and the other one's not, right? So take a moment to work through these examples on your own. What would happen to the equilibrium price and quantity if the price of wheat increases? What would happen if consumers adopt low-carb diets? What would happen if ovens become more energy efficient? Or what would happen if the price of butter increases? Here you might have to assume that bread and butter are complements. So when the price of butter increases, it might reduce demand for bread, since if you don't want any butter to put on your bread, you might not want to buy the bread. What would happen if a decline in pizza sales pushes some pizzerias into the bread market? So you have an increase in the number of bakeries. And what would happen if unemployment falls? And for this last example, you need to go back to the logic from Unit 6. When unemployment falls, what's going to happen to the equilibrium wage, right? And given that, what's going to happen to the cost of producing bread? Right? This may seem pretty abstract, but the price of bread has been very important in sort of leading to revolutions in world history. Right? The poor wheat harvest and the spike in bread prices arguably spiked the revolution of France in 1848, and high commodity prices might have sparked the Arab Spring more recently in 2011. This, of course, is Tahrir Square in right? And again, I'd urge you to think about an example besides the bread market, because from your standpoint, bread is a small fraction of your costs, right? But housing is a high fraction. So in California, for example, 41% of households, 42% of households are cost burdened. That means they pay more than 30% of their incomes on rent, right? In Colorado, it's a little bit less than that, but it's still over 30% of households are paying over 30% of their income on rent, right? In California, right, we see that adjusted for inflation, California has the second highest home prices in the country, right, after Hawaii, and then we see a big increase since the 80s. But we also see that the increase in the quantity supplied hasn't changed much. So if you look at housing permits per capita, new housing permits, we see that California doesn't provide all that many, right? These are permits per 1,000 people. Right now, the new permits are about 4 per 1,000 people, up slightly from maybe 2 around 2010, right, during the Great Recession. Again, we could use this sort of data to think about the housing crisis in California in the supply-demand model. We have a couple points of data that we know for sure, right? In 2010, there were about 2 new housing units per 1,000 people, and the home price was $400,000 on average, right? By 2018, we'd increased, right, the new housing units to 4 per 1,000 people, and the home price had gone up. You can imagine supply curve again, maybe looking at something like this and reflecting a shift out in demand, right? The problem, of course, is a shift out in demand means some people who in 2010 were able to afford a home and willing to pay between $400,000 and $500,000 are now crowded out of the market in 2018 since there are no longer homes available, right? Or the average home is no longer available for $400,000. It's now $500,000, right? And this is the problem. This is part of the reason that California has a huge homelessness crisis, right? So changes in market equilibria benefit some people and harm others, right? Whenever there's a change in price, it's going to help one side of the market and hurt the other. Housing prices are rising very quickly. The winners, obviously, are the people who are building homes or the people who own a bunch of homes and rent them out to others. The losers are people who don't own a home, right, and are renting from somebody and had to pay more and more money, or would like to buy a home but can no longer afford to purchase one. You can think about how, if at all, the rules of the game could be changed to improve this outcome.